Welcome to the Scale the Chaos podcast, where we talk all things contributing to your organization's chaos and dysfunction. I'm Rhonda Lea, founder and owner of Scale the Chaos. Today's guest is Dr. John O'Brien, an incivility expert whose book, Rudeness Rehab, was just released on October 8th and has already reached #1 in the new releases in the Business Image and Etiquette category. Welcome, John. I'm super excited to have you here.
Oh, Rhonda, thank you so much for having me. And I'm really excited to have this conversation with you about a topic that's near and dear to my heart.
Help us understand what it is that led you to this study of rudeness and incivility in the workplace. What was your journey?
I would start, but in terms of the book is an outgrowth of my interest in the impact of stress in the workplace. And it actually comes from a very personal place. My dad was an executive, and he had a major heart attack at the age of 49 and nearly died.
Wow. Oh,
Was
yeah.
never able to work again and died at the age of 63.
Wow.
So work stress was the primary thing that he was very dedicated to his job. He was excellent. He was a great salesperson, a great sales manager, but the environment took its toll.
Mm-hmm.
And that's obviously when we go into the field of psychology, we have to be examining what are the reasons that we do.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly what I saw unfold for my dad, I couldn't help, but that's part of what drove me to the field and the last several years to redirecting my energies towards the workplace and reducing stress there. And as far as incivility is concerned, about 7 years ago, I went to a conference for the Society of Consulting Psychologists, and this expert on civility, Christine Porath, spoke, and she was talking about the profound impact that seemingly inconsequential, rude, and uncivil behaviors have on businesses
Mm-hmm.
and the negative consequences in terms of financial and emotional for the individual, but also for the business. And that really resonated with me and led me down this path of exploring the topic more and bringing together that awareness of incivility in the workplace with my understanding from an individual therapy and clinician perspective of skills that can be useful for helping people to manage difficult situations. So this book really is a combination of these areas of expertise to offer it more than just one-to-one with people in coaching or therapy,
Yeah.
to offer it.
To the world. I think most people have an idea of what rudeness and incivility is. And as I read your book, I started to realize that I think the general idea of it's very far from what the actual general idea is. So help us understand, because that's the whole point of this, right? Is to help us identify that we're actually participating in this. A lot of us aren't aware of it. You talk about that in your book as well. So help us understand how it is that you define this rudeness and this incivility in the workplace.
Okay. Just by way of to geek out for a minute on the root
Yes.
of words, that
Okay.
civility has its roots in the word, I think it was civilitas, but anyway, meaning citizen.
Okay.
Its roots are really in the idea of being a good citizen.
Okay.
And then it was around the 16th century that it shifted into meaning politeness or courtesy. So that's what civility means. Incivility, and especially I would say incivility in the workplace, is about seemingly inconsequential, but nonetheless impactful,
Mm.
rude or negative behaviors that contribute to stress in the workplace and
Uh-huh.
that affect both the person who is the target of the uncivil behavior, people who witness the uncivil behavior, and even the person engaging in the uncivil behavior. And if I may, I just will say there are three different kind of categories of incivility. I think the first one is probably what we tend to think of as incivility, which is being a gossiping, rolling your eyes, speaking to someone in a condescending way, the interpersonal aspects of
Yes.
incivility. But there's also cyber incivility, which is making negative comments in the chat, in Zoom,
Mm-hmm.
or in Slack, or writing a pointed email to
Yes.
someone. That's cyber incivility. And then the third category, what's called victimless incivility,
Uh-huh.
is doing things, basically, the short version is leaving a mess behind you for other
Yes.
people to clean up.
Yes.
So leaving the photocopier jammed. So other people have to deal with that mess before they can do the work they need to do. They have to fix that. Or leaving your dishes in the sink at work for other people to have to work around or do. Um, And sometimes people don't realize the negative impact and frustrations that creates for other people. So it's interpersonal, it's cyber, and it's victimless.
And I like how you said it's seemingly what was it? Sorry.
Seemingly
Seemingly
inconsequential.
inconsequential. Yeah. The seemingly inconsequential. And that's where people don't recognize the impact that that is having on other people. The person
Yes.
who's demonstrating it is oblivious most of the time, but it's those who are receiving it who are having to work around the dirty dishes. Because I don't think a lot of people think about leaving the dirty dishes as being uncivil.
Correct. Yeah.
I think most people think of it as more of like that more pointed, direct communication. And anything outside of that is just you're just being sensitive or that kind of thing. So let's talk about, because you reference this I think it's even in the forward of your book, being civil versus just not being uncivil. It's almost like you're being nice, but you're not being kind, right? So help us understand some of the different nuances between being civil or simply just not being uncivil.
Okay. That's a really great question, I think, and I'm glad you're asking it because it's getting me to think. But the choosing not to be uncivil is more about being neutral, perhaps,
Mm-hmm.
being non-reactive, but that can leave the other person wondering what your actual reaction is. And sometimes we understand both the impact of our behavior, what we're doing, performance or whatever at work, through the response that we get to other people. So just being completely blank or unresponsive. Now, I would also add, I'm thinking out loud here, but sometimes being unresponsive is in fact being uncivil. In other
Yes.
words, that I was just actually talking this morning to a group and I was making the distinction between active incivility, like writing someone a pointed email,
Mm-hmm.
or passive incivility, which is another thing people sometimes do, which is just not responding to someone. And sometimes, whether that's by accident or sometimes it's on purpose,
Mm-hmm.
just to get under someone's skin or not get them the information they need for a project. So
Yes.
sometimes being unresponsive is, in fact, simply being uncivil, not being civil, being uncivil. But sometimes it's also being uncivil.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
versus being civil is politeness, courtesy, and showing people that you support them. Now, what I would also say is that sometimes supporting them is, in fact, giving them difficult feedback. That
Yes.
just because you're being civil doesn't mean you're being a doormat. It also
Yes.
doesn't mean that you aren't giving people feedback that they sometimes need. People sometimes think being civil is simply being warm and fuzzy,
Mm-hmm.
but you can be supportive, but also direct.
Yeah, it goes back to that I'm being nice, but you're not being kind.
Right.
And a lot of times that feedback, you can intentionally give it in a civil way. And that's one of the biggest differences that I feel is civility is very intentional. Like
Mhm.
you're not just going about your day, you're very intentional, but also incivility can also be very intentional as well.
Yes, and often I think, as I say, that all of us, unfortunately, you and I too, we all
Yes.
have stress-related negative behaviors.
Yes. Yes.
And as a business person, and especially for leaders, not to be afraid of trying to understand what those are and being open to that because we've all got them. And when you
Mm-hmm.
get under stress, those leak out, and those are often the root causes of incivility.
Yeah. And you talked about that. You opened up your book with that, pointing out that we are all of us at times are rude and uncivil, right?
Yeah,
And
right.
anybody, and I don't know that you necessarily came out and directly said this, but basically anybody who doesn't think that they are, or they're just in denial, right?
I
In a
would
way,
say,
you didn't say it that way, but
right.
you didn't because that would be you're in denial. But in essence, that's really they're in denial and they need to maybe even reevaluate some of those moments because we all have stressors, right?
Yes,
And
right.
those are the moments where we have to be more intentional to be civil.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think the idea of people who think that they are never uncivil,
Mm-hmm.
I just encourage people to just keep an open mind to the
Yeah.
idea.
Okay.
I was doing a presentation this morning to a bunch of therapists about experiencing incivility from clients, but also being uncivil
Mm-hmm.
to clients. And there were some people, it was a Mentimeter voting, but there were some people who said that they were never
Wow.
uncivil to clients. And so I just said, okay. but I think it's important to keep an open mind.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you may be more direct and say, you're all in denial, but the fact is sometimes it's about growing your awareness to understand that, oh, this, what I'm doing can be interpreted as being uncivil.
Yeah, exactly. So let's talk a little bit more about how this incivility and this rudeness contributes to organizational dysfunction and chaos.
Sure. It starts obviously, well, often, although not always, it starts at the individual level.
Okay.
I'll talk more about something else in a moment, but it usually starts at the individual level and in interactions, and whether it's an interaction from a boss to a
Mm-hmm.
subordinate
Mm-hmm.
or interactions between peers, that seemingly inconsequential but negative behavior can lead people to get frustrated and overwhelmed,
Yes.
and they're therefore distracted about the emotional stuff that's happened.
Mm-hmm.
And that then can lead them to feel demotivated,
Mm-hmm.
feel this organization doesn't support me, feel disconnected from the
Yes.
organization. And that leads to a decline in productivity. And
Absolutely.
it sometimes can lead to pulling back and being more isolated if it's a larger organization in your work group.
Mm-hmm.
It can lead people to being more passive in their work and kind of quiet quitting, if you will, if they're frustrated, not
Mm-hmm.
really engaging. I heard the term cyber loafing, that
Uh-huh.
basically people that experience incivility in the workplace often end up just surfing online, which is part of what gets in the way of productivity.
Uh-huh.
And that over time, often incivility can be contagious
Yes.
and can infect, if it's not well managed, can infect a group or a department. And then
Yes.
that can spread further. And that leads then to reduced productivity and profitability for the organization as a whole.
Yes.
So that certainly is one path. The other path I would just highlight is sometimes the incivility comes from the leader.
Mm-hmm.
I have a colleague who worked at a firm that shall remain nameless for many years, was happy and had a boss that was really supportive, and they were doing really well. And a new person came in as the leader. And in the first meeting, he said he'd been in the group, but he was now elevated to the leader. He said, we've been entirely too nice to each other in this group,
Mm.
and that's going to stop right now. Because his theory was people needed to be uncivil and mean to each other and fight to get the most out of each other.
Yeah.
And my friend said it was almost like you could see people leaning back, going to their phones and updating their LinkedIn profile. And you know what? Many people left.
Yeah. I would imagine. And
So
how this
sometimes,
leader didn't think that was going to happen.
yeah, I don't know what this person was thinking, but
Yeah.
sometimes it comes right from the
Yeah.
top. It just takes one
Absolutely.
thing from a leader
Yeah.
and it's no longer safe. I got to get out.
Yeah. And I had a boss one time. It was the CEO at a company that will remain nameless. They always remain nameless. I would frequently present ideas, and it always seemed like it created some sort of conflict. And I was exhausted by that. So I had made this conscious decision to just agree with whatever he wanted, and we would just go along with that. And I honestly just thought it wasn't like I'm going to teach him. I honestly never expected him to even notice. But a couple months went by and he said, we're working so much better together these days. I don't know what it is. And I said to him, I just decided I was going to stop sharing my opinion with you. And he was like, oh. And then he was, that's not what I want. And I was like, then you have to be more willing to hear me out and be more open to my opinions then, because you haven't been. And that's fine. Like, you're the boss and I'm fine going along. But if you want my opinion, you have to be more open to it, kind of thing. And he was like, that's not at all what I want. And we had a good conversation, but it was just interesting that he even noticed that I had stopped sharing my opinion. Anyways.
No, but I think that's really important, Rhonda, because I think that so many leaders don't sometimes realize what they're doing. He may not
Uh-huh.
have realized
Oh,
that,
yeah.
but
Yeah.
then when you changed your behavior,
Mm-hmm.
to his credit, he noticed and
Yes.
eventually he asked.
Yes.
And good for him,
Yeah.
he
Yeah.
asked, and you
Absolutely.
were honest. Good for you. And guess what? Good for him, he listened. Did
Uh-huh.
he change in the
He
future
did.
beyond
He
that?
did. It got better. I will say it
Yeah.
got better. So, but yeah, it was just interesting. And it was as you were sharing that story that situation came back up into my mind. But yeah,
Yeah.
because I had never necessarily thought of it as incivility, and it was just, he just wasn't interested or hadn't noticed yet, if you will. Okay, so let's talk about the psychological impact. So, because I imagine it can be significant, because what we already talked about, what's driving this incivility and rudeness is stress. So we're already under this mental load if we're already feeling stress. So then what does this incivility, how does that compound that?
I just would add to that that I don't think I've mentioned this, that the American Psychological Association does an APA Stress in America survey every
Uh-huh.
year, and we're about to get the results this month for the past year. But in 2023, the results showed that the stress in our country is at some of the highest levels ever
Yeah.
recorded,
Mm-hmm.
and that two-thirds of people reported that their stress level is higher or somewhat higher in the last year. So two-thirds of people were saying the stress has increased, and I don't anticipate that's going to go down when they do the survey, have done the
Yeah.
survey. So stress feeds on itself.
Yes.
But in terms of, I think your question is about the psychological impact. Uh, People can be more emotionally overwhelmed and therefore emotionally volatile in both the workplace, but sometimes also they bring that stress home.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
That can lead, obviously, to conflicts with partners, problems with kids,
Mm-hmm.
difficulties in their life in general. Sometimes that stress translates into health problems. So, high blood pressure, cardiac problems, diabetes, those physical, I guess I'm getting into physical issues as well, but the
Mm-hmm.
psychological issues, obviously, depression,
Yeah.
anxiety. Substance abuse is a big one sometimes, that people
Okay.
turn to substances as a way to
Mm-hmm.
self-medicate the stress.
Yep. And
Um,
numb it. Yep.
and numb it,
Yeah.
absolutely. So all those things are some of the psychological, and I guess I've tagged in also some of the physical effects.
Yeah. And I would imagine that's really where a lot of it becoming contagious comes from, right? The psychological effects, the adding to the stresses you taking it home, then can be contagious at home. It can be contagious to, especially if it's a leader who's experiencing the significant stress, it's passed on to the team members. So, all kinds of ways that it can be passed on as our own stress levels rise.
Absolutely. And I talk about it as the new pandemic,
Yes.
that we're just in the getting over the after effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, but
Mm-hmm.
this is like another pandemic that has seemingly swept not just our country, but cultures around the world.
So, what roles do leaders play? So, because we talked about it, it can start at the top, right?
Mhm.
So, obviously, there's some responsibility there, but also from the standpoint of as they notice it maybe in their team members and wanting to keep it from spreading to the rest of the team or the rest of the organization. So, what is the role that these team leaders would play?
I'm sure you've heard the term psychological safety,
Mm-hmm.
and creating an environment where people feel comfortable to share their opinions, like you were talking about
Yeah.
before with your boss, that you initially didn't have that because it was just like everything you said was shot down. So I'm just not going to
Yeah.
share. But fortunately, with the change of your behavior and with the change of his behavior, he shifted it around. I think leaders need to be mindful about what type of environment are they creating for their
Mm-hmm.
employees in general. So that includes then having the type of relationship with your direct reports where they feel comfortable coming to you if they are experiencing incivility,
Yes.
either in meetings where you are but you don't see it,
Mm-hmm.
or when you're not around.
Yes.
And so leaders can be a good sounding board and source of support, and sometimes advocates for their direct reports.
Yes,
Um,
absolutely.
and sometimes leaders can also need to be the ones to call out the behavior when it occurs in a meeting,
Mm-hmm.
because they have a power. And so if one direct report rolls their eyes and scoffs when another direct report says something, how that
Yeah.
leader responds in that moment is then going to set the tone for the group.
Yes. Yeah, because I've worked at organizations where it was the leader who would often behave in that way.
Yeah.
And everybody felt because the leader was acting that way, it was a free for all. Everybody could behave in that way. And the culture was highly toxic because of that.
Yeah, and apparently there's a book out of, I don't know, but there are some people who still hold to the idea that you need that type of environment, that kind of competitive environment to get the most out of people. And I don't know who's spreading that gospel, but it's fake news as far as
Yeah,
I'm concerned because you don't get the best out of people. You don't.
that it has never been my experience that you get more out of people when you treat them like that. And again, that's where it grows, because then it just adds to the stress and the chaos and contagious. And
Mhm.
that's where it's got trickled down.
Yes.
Thank you so much for joining us, John. This was exciting. I enjoyed our conversation. And listeners out there, make sure you check out John's latest book, Rudeness Rehab, for more strategies and insights on rudeness rehab. And for more information on how you can scale the chaos in your organization, you can head on over to my website, scalethechaos.com. And you can also find more podcasts at scalethechaos.com/podcasts. I'm Rhonda Lea, and we'll chat more next time.